We've just received confirmation that James and Stanley have been slapped with a 1,000 dirham fine each and have had their travel ban removed. So this is after having been stuck in Dubai for over 2 months. They flew on the 31st of August, so they've been there quite a while, anticipating a potential prison sentence of in excess of a year. I think the important thing to note here is that they were actually convicted of assault. So yes, they only received a 1,000 dirham fine, and I believe that's because the international spotlight was on them and the media spotlight. They were on the BBC and they were outspoken about their situation. Otherwise, they might have faced a more severe sentence. So a 1,000 dirham fine each, and they're leaving now, so they're booking the next flight, actually, they said. So hopefully they'll be home in England soon. But the important factor here is that they were actually convicted of a crime, and that crime was assault. And this is in spite of the CCTV evidence that clearly disproves the allegations coming from the rental car company. Now, the rental car company had demanded quite extortionate amounts of money despite having an insurance contract with the boys, and when they weren't paid, well, some were paid, some demands were paid, and the boys had hoped that they would come home as a result of that, but the demands just became so high that the boys simply couldn't afford it. And this is when assault charges were levied against the boys. Now, these assault charges were based on the boys having taken a passport, their own passport, James's passport, and exiting the building. Now, actually, the rental car agents grabbed them, but they didn't fight at all, and the CCTV evidence, which we've put up on YouTube, clearly exonerates them of any wrongdoing on assault charges, and yet they were still convicted. Now, Dubai does this a lot. When there's a false allegation against someone, even where there's no evidence, if they want to close the situation, and in this case they should never have prosecuted this case, having seen the CCTV footage, but they still prosecuted it, and that's just to put it through the courts, and the courts think that the fastest and easiest thing to do is simply to issue a fine and let them go, and they think that that closes the matter. But unfortunately, that's a terrible attitude, because you're convicting people of criminal offences that they haven't committed. And in this case, okay, it's only a fine. But in other cases, especially where there's drugs involved, that can lead to people having a real problem in the future, travelling, having to disclose a drugs conviction. And this is just a totally unacceptable practice of Dubai, to just ram it through the courts, issue them with a fine, and think that that's acceptable. It's not. If someone has not committed a crime, it shouldn't be prosecuted. If there's no evidence, it shouldn't be prosecuted. And if there's no evidence to secure a conviction other than the verbal allegation of someone who has made the complaint, then the court should not convict them either. They should be fully acquitted and allowed to return. So this practice is extremely unacceptable, and although the boys are coming home, they've spent an absolute fortune fighting off this extortion. They've spent a fortune fighting for their freedom, and they've been stuck in a country for over 2 months that they had only expected to spend a few days in as tourists. So is this really a safe place for tourism? Is this a safe place for people to visit? We're seeing reports that the UAE is relaxing its laws, but is it increasing safeguards and protections for tourists? And at this point, they're not, because this kind of practice of convicting tourists without evidence is going to continue. So we'll hear from James and Stanley soon. They're extremely grateful for all of the support, and they're just madly trying to book flights, and we hope to hear their story when they're safely back in England. But for now, the British government absolutely needs to do something to protect British citizens, because the UAE's marketing that tourists are going to be protected, tourists are welcome, it's not being reflected in the judicial system, it's not being reflected in the penal system or with the police enforcement. We're still seeing arbitrary detentions, we're still seeing false allegations without evidence being prosecuted through the courts. Until this changes, the UAE remains an unsafe place for visitors.